My name is Coretta. I am 68 years old, and my occupation is a retired high school principal. They shoved me into a run-down nursing home, practically foaming at the mouth to get their hands on the estate I had spent my entire twilight years meticulously building. My own son and his wife had already started taking sledgehammers to my walls and redesigning my house, absolutely convinced they had successfully silenced a useless and oblivious old woman. What those two arrogant fools did not realize was that they were actively committing criminal trespass on my privately owned land, and they were about to trigger an avalanche they could never escape. It is funny how quickly the children you bleed for can turn into strangers. My journey to this bitter moment started decades ago when my husband passed away far too soon. He left me a young widow with a little boy named Jamal to raise all on my own. I did not crumble. I tightened my belt, put my head down, and worked my way up to become a high school principal. I poured every ounce of my energy into giving Jamal a good life. I worked late hours, stretched every single dollar, and sacrificed my own youth so he could go to college without drowning in student loans. I paid for his degree, cooked his meals, and made sure he never felt the crushing weight of the poverty that constantly threatened to pull us under. You would think a son raised with that kind of sacrifice would grow up to respect his mother. But somewhere along the line, Jamal lost his way. Today, I live a very simple life by choice. I drive a beat-up sedan that has seen better days, and I buy my clothes from the clearance racks. I clip coupons and watch my spending. Because of this, Jamal and his pretentious wife Chloe look at me with absolute disgust. Whenever they visit, which is rare, and usually out of obligation, they roll their eyes at my faded furniture. Chloe never misses a chance to make a snide remark about my bargain shoes or my outdated kitchen. They sneer at my frugality, treating me like an embarrassing relic they have to tolerate. They look down their noses at me, utterly convinced that I am just a poor, clueless pensioner living off scraps. But appearances can be a brilliant weapon. While they were busy mocking my worn-out sweaters, I was busy building an empire in the shadows. When my husband died, he left behind a modest life insurance policy. Instead of squandering it, I combined it with decades of my own strict savings and began investing. I quietly purchased commercial properties and residential lots, shielding every single asset behind a private limited liability company. I am the sole owner, holding 100% of the shares. I kept this wealth entirely hidden from Jamal. I chose silence because I wanted my son to become a self-sufficient man. I wanted him to build his own work ethic and learn to stand on his own 2 feet without waiting for a handout from his mother. I wanted to protect him from the laziness that unearned wealth can bring. I never expected that my protective silence would reveal his true nature. I never imagined that the boy I raised to be strong and honorable would marry a woman whose heart was entirely consumed by greed, or that he would allow her to infect him with the same disease. They thought my frugality was weakness. They thought my age made me an easy target. They assumed I was just a tired old widow waiting to be pushed aside so they could claim the meager inheritance they believed I had. But they woke up the wrong woman, and they were about to discover exactly who they were messing with. The Sunday dinners used to be a sacred ritual in my home. I would spend all Saturday marinating the roast, preparing the collard greens, and baking my signature sweet potato pie. It was a labor of love, a tradition I maintained, even when my joints ached, just to see my son sitting at my table. But those gatherings slowly morphed into calculated psychological warfare. It started with subtle jabs. Chloe would walk into my spotless living room, run her manicured finger over the antique credenza, and loudly sigh. She would look at my home, the house I had scrubbed and polished for decades, and wrinkle her nose as if she had just stepped into a landfill. She began making pointed comments about my memory, dropping little seeds of doubt into the conversation. She would ask me if I had forgotten to dust the ceiling fans, Or she would claim we had a conversation the week prior about my failing health that I knew for a fact never happened. I am a retired high school principal. My mind is as sharp as a tack. I managed massive budgets, handled unruly teenagers, and negotiated with the school board. Yet here was this arrogant young woman trying to gaslight me in my own dining room. Jamal did not defend me. Instead, my son, the boy I bled for, began to echo her condescending tone. The ultimate insult arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Jamal walked into my kitchen and demanded my car keys. He did not ask. He demanded. He put on a fake look of deep concern and told me it was for my own safety. He claimed he had seen a scratch on the bumper of my old sedan and decided I was becoming a danger on the road. There was no scratch. I knew every inch of that car. But he reached into my purse, took the keys, and slipped them into his pocket with a patronizing pat on my shoulder. I was suddenly grounded, stripped of my independence by the very person I taught to walk. Then came the intrusion of Brad. Brad was Chloe's older brother, a slick, fast-talking man who wore suits that were a little too tight and smiled a little too widely. Suddenly, Brad was a permanent fixture at our Sunday dinners. He never brought a dish or a bottle of wine, but he brought an unnerving habit of evaluating my property. I would catch him tapping the walls, examining the original hardwood floors, and peering out the windows to check the property lines. He looked at my home not as a place of gathering, but as a piece of meat he was waiting to carve up. I watched them all sitting at the head of my table, enduring their disrespect. I kept my mouth shut, but my eyes were wide open. I knew they were plotting something, but the true depth of their depravity was something even my worst nightmares could not have conjured. The revelation came on a chilly evening in late November. They had come over for dinner, and I had excused myself to the kitchen to cut the pie. The dining room was adjacent to the kitchen, separated by a heavy oak door that I had left slightly ajar. I stood silently near the doorway holding a silver pie server when the tone of their voices shifted. The fake sweetness melted away, replaced by the hushed, urgent tones of conspirators. I stopped breathing and listened. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. Jamal was in trouble. He was speaking frantically about massive debts, hundreds of thousands of dollars lost in foolish cryptocurrency investments. He sounded desperate, whining that the creditors were closing in on him. Then Brad chimed in, his voice slick and confident. Brad laid out a plan, so meticulously evil that I had to lean against the kitchen counter to keep from collapsing. Brad suggested they manufacture a fake medical history for me. He boasted about knowing a corrupt doctor who owed him a favor, a man perfectly willing to sign a formal evaluation stating that I was suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia. Brad explained that with this fake diagnosis, they could legally force me into a nursing home. But not just any nursing home. Brad had a contact at a cheap rundown facility on the outskirts of the city, a place notorious for heavily sedating its residents and keeping them out of sight. Once I was locked away and stripped of my rights, Jamal would assume full power of attorney. He would take control of my finances, sell my house, and use the money to wipe out his crypto debt while splitting the remainder of the profits with Chloe and Brad. I stood in the shadows of my kitchen, a hand pressed tightly over my mouth. My own son was participating in a conspiracy to steal my life. I waited for Jamal to object. I waited for the boy I raised to stand up and defend his mother. I waited for him to say that this was going crazy, that he could never do something so monstrous to the woman who sacrificed everything for him. Instead, the final blow came from Jamal himself. His words cut through the air and struck my heart with fatal precision. He sighed heavily and said, "She has lived long enough now, it is time she pays us back." Those words echoed in my mind. Pays us back. Pays them back for what? For the nights I worked late to buy his school clothes, for the college tuition I paid so he would graduate debt-free, for the endless meals, the doctor visits, the unwavering support I had given him my youth, my energy, and my entire heart. And his response was to treat my life as a debt. He was finally cashing in. The physical pain in my chest was agonizing. I felt as if the air had been vacuumed from the room. My vision blurred with tears of profound grief. But the grief did not last long. As I listened to them chuckle and toast to their brilliant scheme, the sorrow inside me crystallized into something else. The sadness hardened into a cold, unbreakable fury. I did not storm into the dining room. I did not scream or throw the pie. I wiped my face, smoothed my apron, and walked back into the room with a pleasant, vacant smile, serving them the dessert they felt so entitled to eat. They thought they were dealing with a senile victim. They had no idea they were sitting across from a woman who had just decided to go to war. The final push came exactly 4 days later. I was sitting in my favorite armchair reading a book when the front door swung open. Jamal and Brad marched into my living room without knocking. They looked like two men walking onto a battlefield, carrying a thick stack of legal documents clipped to a sturdy clipboard. Chloe walked in right behind them, her arms crossed, and a smug, victorious expression plastered across her face. Jamal sat down on the coffee table right in front of me, blocking my view. He put on his most caring, gentle voice, a tone so sickeningly sweet it made my stomach churn. He placed the clipboard on my lap and handed me a pen. He told me these were just some routine papers to update my health insurance. He said the hospital needed my signature to ensure I would be fully covered for the upcoming year, and that I just needed to sign on the dotted lines to make things easier for everyone. I looked down at the papers. I did not need my reading glasses to see the bold letters at the top of the page. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney and a medical proxy form. It was the legal key to my entire existence. I looked back up at Jamal, keeping my face perfectly blank, and calmly placed the pen back on the table. I told him I would not sign anything without having my own lawyer review it first. The facade dropped instantly. Jamal stood up, his face flushing red with sudden anger. Before he could speak, Chloe stepped forward, completely dropping the act of the concerned daughter-in-law. Her voice was sharp and laced with absolute malice. She leaned over me and sneered, telling me that I did not have a choice. She boldly declared that they already had a doctor on standby, ready to sign an affidavit declaring me mentally incompetent. She threatened that if I did not sign the papers voluntarily, they would take it to a judge, drag me through a humiliating court process, and have me committed anyway. She said they would make sure the judge saw a frail, confused old woman who was a danger to herself. Then Jamal delivered their ultimatum. He pointed his finger at me and said I had exactly 3 days to pack a single suitcase. He told me that on Monday morning, a transport van was coming to take me to a care facility. He warned me that if I fought them, if I caused a scene, or refused to leave, they would call an ambulance and have me forcibly removed with a police escort. They gave me 3 days to say goodbye to my home, my independence, and my life. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry and beg for mercy. They wanted to see me break down, because that would prove to them that they held all the power. So I gave them exactly what they wanted to see. I let my hands shake. I widened my eyes in feigned terror. I let my voice tremble as I asked them why they were doing this to me. I shrank back into my armchair, pulling my cardigan tightly around my shoulders, playing the part of a terrified, defenseless old woman who had just realized she was completely trapped. I cried real tears, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of a mother mourning the death of her son, because the man standing in front of me was dead to me. Chloe smirked, clearly satisfied with my display of weakness. Jamal looked away, perhaps feeling a fleeting second of guilt, but he quickly hardened his face and turned toward the door. The three of them walked out of my house, leaving the documents on my table, absolutely certain they had won the war without shedding a single drop of blood. They thought I would spend the next 3 days packing my meager belongings and weeping over my cruel fate. They did not know that the moment the front door clicked shut, my tears stopped instantly. My hands stopped shaking. I stood up from my armchair, my spine straight, and my mind blazing with absolute clarity. They had given me 3 days, 72 hours. It was more than enough time for a woman who secretly owned a multi-million-dollar real estate empire to orchestrate the most devastating, legally airtight, and ruthless counterattack they could ever imagine. They wanted to take my house. They were about to lose everything. I spent 35 years managing hormonal teenagers, lying students, and manipulative parents as a high school principal. I knew exactly how to spot a liar, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to play along when it served my purpose. When Jamal and Chloe laid out their devastating ultimatum, giving me just 3 days to pack my life into a single suitcase, they expected a broken old woman. I gave them exactly that. I let my shoulders slump, curling inward, as if the weight of their cruelty had physically crushed my spine. I forced my hands to tremble visibly as I clutched the fabric of my worn cardigan. I lowered my gaze to the floor, nodding slowly, muttering quiet, broken apologies that fed directly into their inflated egos. The transformation was flawless. Jamal actually let out a long sigh of relief, his tense posture relaxing as he glanced at his wife. Chloe smirked, practically vibrating with the thrill of her victory. They were so utterly convinced of their own brilliance, so completely blinded by their greed, that they dropped their guard entirely. They assumed my sudden submission meant my mind was already slipping, just as their fabricated medical documents claimed. That night, after they confidently locked my front door and drove away to celebrate their impending wealth, the house settled into a heavy silence. I waited an hour just to be absolutely certain they were gone. Then I stood up from my armchair. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly, my posture straightened, and the terrified old widow was replaced by the calculating woman who had built a silent real estate empire. I moved through the dark hallways of my home like a ghost, my mind operating with cold, surgical precision. My first stop was my home office. I booted up my computer and accessed the hidden security system I had installed months ago, a system Jamal knew absolutely nothing about. The cameras captured everything. I had crystal clear audio and video of Brad proposing the fake dementia diagnosis. I had Jamal whining about his massive cryptocurrency debts and agreeing to the plot. I had Chloe threatening to have me dragged out by the police. I meticulously downloaded every single file, saving multiple copies to encrypted flash drives and secure cloud storage accounts. I was building an impenetrable fortress of evidence. Next, I walked softly into the dining room. In their arrogant haste, Jamal and Brad had carelessly left a folder of their forged documents sitting right on the mahogany table. They were so certain I was defeated that they did not even bother to hide their weapons. I turned on a small reading lamp and pulled out my smartphone. I photographed every single page. I captured the fake medical evaluation signed by Brad's corrupt doctor friend. I photographed the fraudulent power of attorney they planned to file. I took clear, high-resolution pictures of their signatures, their dates, and their entire criminal conspiracy laid bare on white paper. With the evidence secured, I moved to my bedroom to begin packing. They had told me to pack a single suitcase for the nursing home. I did exactly that, but I did not pack my life away. I carefully selected only my most treasured, irreplaceable keepsakes. I packed the vintage pearl necklace my husband gave me on our 20th anniversary. I packed the original deed to my first property, my birth certificate, and the small velvet box containing my wedding ring. I left the closets full of clearance rack clothes. I left the outdated furniture, the dusty photo albums containing pictures of the son I no longer recognized, and the worn-out knickknacks they so deeply despised. I left it all behind as the perfect bait. To them, the house would look like the tragic remnants of a confused woman who had been rushed out the door. To me, it was simply a shell I was shedding. The very next morning, while Jamal and Chloe were busy finalizing their arrangements for my captivity, I put on a pair of dark sunglasses, wrapped a thick scarf around my head, and slipped out the back door of my house. I walked 2 blocks down the street before hailing a taxi. I directed the driver to the financial district downtown, specifically to the towering glass skyscraper that housed the law firm of Elias Thorne. Elias was not just any lawyer. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a brilliant corporate attorney who had helped me establish my limited liability company decades ago. He was the only person on earth who knew the true extent of my wealth. When I walked into his spacious corner office, Elias took one look at my face and knew it was time for war. I sat across from him at his massive desk and pulled the encrypted flash drive from my purse. I handed it to him along with my phone, instructing him to look at the photographs I had taken the night before. I sat in quiet composure while Elias plugged in the drive and reviewed the evidence. I watched his professional demeanor shift from mild curiosity to absolute cold anger. He clicked through the forged medical documents, his eyes narrowing as he read the fabricated dementia diagnosis and the fraudulent power of attorney. Elias leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at me and confirmed what I already knew. The house Jamal and Chloe were planning to steal and sell did not technically belong to Coretta the individual. It belonged to my LLC. I was the sole managing member of the board. Elias explained the legal reality with a sharp, predatory smile. He told me that any attempt to sell, transfer, or leverage a property owned by an LLC, without the explicit, legally verified consent of the board, was not just a family dispute. It was corporate fraud. It was a federal crime. Because they were using forged medical documents across state banking lines to facilitate the sale, they were stepping into the realm of federal wire fraud and conspiracy. I asked Elias if we should stop them right now. I asked if we should serve them with a restraining order and present the evidence to the police immediately. Elias shook his head, his eyes glinting with strategic malice. He proposed a much larger net for a much bigger catch. He explained that if we stopped them now, they could claim it was a misunderstanding. They could hire slick defense attorneys and argue that they were genuinely concerned for my health, potentially walking away with a slap on the wrist. Instead, Elias suggested we let them proceed. We let them put me in that dreadful nursing home. We let them file the fraudulent power of attorney with the county clerk. We let them sign the listing agreement with a real estate agent to sell my house. By allowing them to execute their plan, we would transform their conspiracy from a mere idea into a fully realized, documented, undeniable felony. We would hand the authorities a completed crime wrapped in a bow. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had worn in weeks. I agreed to the plan, agreed to the IBCA. The morning of my departure was a masterclass in psychological cruelty. Jamal and Chloe arrived at my house bright and early, their faces practically glowing with suppressed excitement. I stood in the hallway clutching my single small suitcase, wearing an oversized grey sweater to make myself look as frail and diminished as possible. Jamal refused to make eye contact with me. He grabbed my suitcase with a brisk, businesslike motion, staring at the wall as he muttered that we needed to hit the road to beat the traffic. Chloe, however, had no such reservations. She stood in my living room, her eyes roaming over my walls, mentally measuring the space for the renovations she planned to fund with my money. She looked at me, her lips curling into a vicious smirk, and whispered that I was going to absolutely love the cherry-flavored Jell-O at my new home. The car ride was suffocatingly silent. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window as we drove further and further away from the comfortable suburbs and into a bleak, industrial part of the county. The nursing home they had chosen was exactly as Brad had promised. It was a depressing cinder block building surrounded by a dying lawn and a chain-link fence. The air inside smelled strongly of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the linoleum floors. Jamal marched up to the front desk, handed the administrator a thick envelope containing the forged medical directives, and paid for my first month in cash. He turned to me finally, forcing himself to meet my eyes for a fraction of a second. He gave my shoulder a stiff, awkward pat, told me to be a good girl for the nurses, and practically sprinted for the exit. Chloe lingered just long enough to give me a slow, mocking wave before she turned on her designer heel and strutted out the glass double doors. I stood perfectly still in the sterile lobby, watching through the glass as Jamal started the car. I watched them pull out of the parking lot and speed away, leaving me to rot. The moment their taillights vanished around the corner, my posture changed. The trembling stopped. The frail, confused old woman evaporated into the stale air of the nursing home. I stood up tall, squared my shoulders, and gripped the handle of my suitcase with absolute firmness. The receptionist at the desk called out my name, asking me to follow her to my assigned room. I turned to her, my voice sharp, clear, and dripping with authority. I told her there had been a change of plans and that I would not be staying. Before she could process my words or scramble to check her paperwork, I turned and walked straight down the hallway toward the rear exit of the building. I pushed open the heavy metal fire door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Idling quietly in the back alley was a sleek, immaculate black Lincoln town car. The rear door swung open as I approached. I climbed inside, sinking into the plush leather seats. Elias Thorne sat across from me, a crystal tumbler of sparkling water in his hand and a thick file of legal documents resting on his lap. He looked at me, a victorious gleam in his eye, and asked if the performance went well. I told him it went flawlessly. The driver put the car in gear and smoothly pulled away from the depressing facility, leaving the stench of bleach far behind. We did not drive back to my house. We drove to a 5-star luxury hotel in the heart of the city, where Elias had already booked the penthouse suite under a corporate account. I walked into the magnificent room, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine, walked over to the glass, and toasted to the city below. Jamal and Chloe thought they had buried me. They did not know I was sitting comfortably in a penthouse, watching their every move, waiting for the exact moment to pull the trigger and watch their entire world collapse. It had been exactly 7 days since they dumped me in that stench-filled nursing home. 7 days of me living in absolute luxury in a downtown penthouse while my son and his wife dug their own graves. I sat on a plush velvet sofa, sipping a cup of imported Earl Grey tea, my laptop resting on the glass coffee table in front of me. The hidden security cameras I had installed weeks prior were broadcasting a live feed of my living room directly to my screen. What I saw would have broken a normal mother's heart. My living room, the space where I had spent countless hours grading papers and watching Jamal grow into a man, was unrecognizable. The air was thick with white drywall dust. They had rented sledgehammers and were actively tearing down the wall that separated the kitchen from the dining area. Jamal was sweating, swinging the heavy hammer with a destructive enthusiasm I had never seen him apply to an honest day's work. Chloe stood off to the side, holding a crystal champagne flute from my own china cabinet, her designer shoes covered in chalky debris. Brad was lounging on my plastic-covered sofa, laughing loudly as he popped the cork on a second bottle of expensive champagne. They had undoubtedly bought using the credit cards they stole from my desk. They were celebrating a victory they had not actually won. The audio feed was crystal clear. Brad leaned forward, pointing his champagne glass at Jamal, boasting about the incredible deal he had just secured. He proudly announced that he had found a cash buyer willing to pay top dollar for the property once the open concept renovations were finished. He even bragged that he had already collected a massive non-refundable cash deposit from the naive buyer, completely bypassing standard escrow procedures. Jamal wiped his forehead, grinning like a fool, as he talked about the custom European sports car he was going to buy next week. He was eagerly describing the leather interior and the engine specifications, spending imaginary money that he believed he had successfully stolen from his senile mother. Chloe chimed in, dreaming out loud about the lavish vacations they would take, and the expensive remodeling she planned to do on their own house with her share of the profits. They clinked their glasses together, proposing a cheerful toast to their newfound wealth. They were absolutely drunk on their own arrogance, completely oblivious to the fact that they were starring in a high-definition surveillance movie produced by the very woman they thought they had discarded. I watched them tear my beloved home apart, piece by piece. But I did not shed a single tear. I just took another sip of my tea, memorizing every single word of their premature celebration, knowing that their joy was about to expire in a matter of hours. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided it was time to drop the final curtain on their little show. I dressed meticulously for the occasion. I put away the oversized grey sweaters and cheap orthopedic shoes I had used to play the part of a frail old woman. Instead, I wore a sharp-tailored midnight blue suit that commanded respect. I draped a silk scarf around my neck, put on my favorite pearl earrings, and stood tall. I looked exactly like the woman I truly was. A powerful, wealthy, retired principal who bowed to absolutely no one. Elias Thorne met me in the hotel lobby, accompanied by the local county sheriff and 2 armed deputies who had been thoroughly briefed on the situation. We drove to my neighborhood in a silent convoy. When we pulled up to the curb, I could hear the loud thump of bass, heavy music thumping from inside my house. They were throwing a full-blown demolition party. The sheriff stepped up to my front door and pounded his heavy fist against the wood. The loud, authoritative knocks echoed over the music, causing the thumping bass to suddenly cut off. The door swung open, revealing a sweaty, dust-covered Jamal holding a sledgehammer. His annoyed expression vanished the instant he saw the sheriff standing on his porch. Before my son could even process the police presence, I stepped out from behind the deputies and walked right past him into my own foyer. I stood in the center of the ruined living room, radiating absolute authority and perfect mental clarity. Jamal dropped the sledgehammer. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, heavy thud. He stared at me with his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and rising terror. He looked at my tailored suit, my perfect posture, and the sharp, unforgiving intelligence in my eyes. He realized in a fraction of a second that the senile, helpless mother he thought he had dumped at a rundown nursing home never actually existed. Chloe let out a high-pitched gasp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor, joining the dust and debris. She stumbled backward, bumping into the wall, her face draining of all color as she stuttered, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. Brad, however, was too arrogant to realize the game was over. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward with a false swagger, trying to salvage the situation. He confidently addressed the sheriff, waving a hand in my direction and speaking with dripping condescension. He loudly declared that the police had no business being there. He claimed that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and had clearly wandered away from my care facility. Brad crossed his arms, insisting that my presence here was just proof of my deteriorating mental state. He shouted that they were the legal guardians of the estate and that the sheriff was interrupting private family business. He smirked at me, completely convinced that his forged documents were an impenetrable shield. but his smug grin was about to be wiped off his face permanently. He demanded that the deputies escort me back to the nursing home immediately before I hurt myself. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned to Elias, who stepped forward with a sleek leather briefcase in his hands, ready to deliver the fatal blow to their pathetic conspiracy. Elias Thorne opened his briefcase with the calm, measured precision of an executioner. He pulled out a thick stack of certified corporate documents bearing the state seal and handed them directly to the sheriff. Elias spoke in a booming voice that echoed off the ruined walls. He informed Brad that the power of attorney he had forged was entirely worthless. He explained that Coretta, the individual, did not own the property. The house was owned by a private limited liability company. Any attempt to authorize the sale, transfer, or demolition of corporate property required the explicit consent of the board of directors. Elias then smiled coldly and announced that I was the sole managing member of that board. Brad turned a sickly shade of pale as Elias produced the hidden camera photographs of the forged medical directives and the fraudulent real estate deposit contract. The sheriff did not hesitate. He ordered his deputies to move in. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Brad's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Brad was read his rights and placed under arrest for felony real estate fraud, grand larceny, and forgery of legal documents. He was dragged out the front door, kicking and screaming, his arrogant swagger completely destroyed. I then turned my attention to Jamal and Chloe, who were huddled together, trembling like cornered animals. I looked my son directly in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of maternal warmth I had ever held for him. I told them with absolute ice in my voice that this house did not belong to a confused old woman. It belonged to a corporation. I pointed to the smashed drywall, the ruined hardwood, and the shattered fixtures. I informed them that they had just intentionally destroyed $500,000 of corporate property without authorization. I wished them the best of luck, paying the massive restitution bill that my corporate lawyers would be filing against them in federal court the very next morning. The sheriff stepped forward and gave them exactly 2 minutes to vacate the premises. They were officially trespassing on corporate land. My son and his greedy wife were marched out of my house in the dead of night, with nothing but the dust on their clothes, facing complete financial ruin and impending criminal charges for vandalism. The trap had closed perfectly, and I had finally reclaimed my life. Brad did not just walk away with a slap on the wrist. When you mess with federal corporate real estate laws and forge legal documents, the justice system does not play nice. He was sentenced to a lengthy stay in a federal penitentiary, where his slick suits and arrogant smirk did him absolutely no good. As for Jamal and Chloe, their glorious dreams of sports cars and designer renovations shattered into 1,000,000 jagged pieces. The invoice my corporate attorneys handed them for the unauthorized demolition of my property was astronomical. It was a $500,000 debt they could not dodge. Without the money they had so eagerly anticipated stealing from me, they completely buckled under the financial weight. The stress of impending bankruptcy and the constant harassing calls from creditors poisoned whatever shallow affection they had for one another. Their marriage dissolved into a bitter, venomous divorce, with each of them screaming and pointing fingers at the other in a desperate attempt to shift the blame. Jamal lost his job shortly after the scandal became public, and Chloe found herself completely broke, moving into a tiny, run-down apartment that was far worse than the one she used to mock me for living in. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, but they only succeeded in destroying their own lives. Once the dust settled, I made a swift and clinical decision. I sold that house. It held beautiful memories of my late husband, but the greed of my son had permanently stained its walls. The property fetched a handsome price on the market, and I took every single cent of that profit and established a foundation. I opened a robust scholarship fund dedicated to helping underprivileged high school students pay for college, ensuring that hard-working kids could achieve their dreams without the crushing burden of debt. It was a fitting tribute to my years as an educator and a profound cleansing of my soul. I formally and legally completely removed Jamal and his wife Chloe from every single one of my wills and financial trusts. He will not receive a single dime of the empire I built. With the foundation thriving and my assets secure, I finally embraced the absolute freedom I had denied myself for so long. I packed my bags and began to travel the world, trading the quiet suburbs for the breathtaking beauty of grand cities and spectacular natural landmarks. I walked through ancient cobblestone streets in Europe and marveled at cascading waterfalls in South America. I have finally learned how to truly live and breathe again. Right now, I am sitting on a pristine white sand beach, listening to the soothing sound of the waves crashing against the shore, while gentle instrumental background music plays from a small nearby cafe. I have a glass of chilled, expensive white wine in my hand, and the warm evening breeze feels like a gentle blessing on my skin. I am finally enjoying the wealth I built with my own two hands, entirely on my own terms, answering to absolutely no one. Looking back on this entire ordeal, I have learned a harsh but necessary truth. The greed of your own flesh and blood can sometimes be the most ruthless and devastating poison you will ever encounter. We are taught to give everything to our children, but motherhood is not a license for them to trample on your self-respect or steal your independence. As women, especially as we enter the twilight of our lives, we must never allow anyone to strip away our right to control our own destiny. We spend decades nurturing and protecting others, but there comes a time when we must fiercely protect ourselves. You are not a burden, and you are never too old to fight back and reclaim the power that is rightfully yours. If my journey of taking back my power and serving cold, hard justice made you feel vindicated, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We are building a wonderful community here at Her Golden Years Stories, a place where we share our truths, our triumphs, and our unwavering resilience. I would absolutely love to hear from you. Please drop down into the comments and tell me exactly what city you are watching from today and what time it is right now where you are. Your continued support truly means the world to me, and it directly helps me keep bringing you these powerful, inspiring experiences week after week without fail. Make sure you have your notifications turned on so you never miss a new upload. Until we meet again in the next story, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, stay happy, stand tall, and always remain incredibly strong, my beautiful sisters.